Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the first week of Ancient Greek Philosophy Online. This video is going to be the sort of like introductory video. What is Greek philosophy? What is the period that we're studying, and why are we studying this period in particular? It's expected that you watch this video in the first week and also the next video that should also be in your week one module in Canvas, which is a deep dive into one of the philosophers I asked you to read for this first week, and that's Heraclitus. So this is going to be more general in our aim, in our scope. We're trying to get like a broad handle on what we find interesting, why it is that we study ancient Greek philosophy still some 2,000 years later, and getting a general sense, a general overview of what this period of philosophy is and what it's all going to be about. Of course, many aspects of this picture are going to just have to be sort of general in nature and then filled in more detail as we continue to move throughout the course. So whenever I give these lectures, I'm going to try to always read out everything that's on the board, so that way you don't need to rely on my handwriting, which can be rather iffy sometimes. It's mostly okay today. We're doing Introduction to Greek Philosophy, and the first thing that I have on the board here is a little number line, a timeline running from roughly 700 BC to about 31 BC, or you can think of it as like year zero if you would prefer, right? People disagree as to how exactly to classify different periods in Greek history. But generally, it's agreed that one period of philosophy that we're going to be looking at, which we don't have exact dates precisely because the evidence that we have is so old, many of it we had to sort of reconstruct, comes from quite a long time ago. It comes from this period that we call the Archaic Age. And oftentimes, what we're going to rely on, if you've done a little bit of the reading already, is indirect reports, right? In this period, writing is not very common. There, may be some very particular people who know how to write, and writing is employed in certain extremely specialized contexts. But for the most part, especially when we're thinking about philosophy and we're thinking about the Greek way of life, the Greek conception of itself, it primarily is in oral tradition, in part just because paper is so difficult to get a handle on, right? It's hard to get papyrus, it's hard to get ink, it's hard to keep books in good condition. It's hard to maintain them in an environment where you don't have temperature control, you don't have weather control, and so on, right? And so our ability to understand philosophy that is so culturally distant from us, right? We live in the 21st century. We have air conditioning. We have computers, all of these various things. We have all of the scientific and intellectual advances that come with world history over the past 2,000 some odd years, right? And so there are a lot of advantages that we have today that were not available to the Greeks of this period. And so some of the oldest material that we're going to be looking at is around 625 or so BC. Once again, the dates are a little bit disputed because much of the evidence that we have for this is indirect, right? There's not many books written. The books that are written are often destroyed, right? And so a lot of the times what you're going to be reading this week, for example, is you're going to be reading a lot of fragments. You're going to be reading a lot of like Aristotle quotes Thales or whoever as saying this, right? And this is the only evidence that we have available of their doctrines or beliefs, right? We don't have a book that they wrote or anything like that, right? You have an oral tradition that's passed down over very many generations, and these amount to sort of like testimonies of what these people said. And eventually, those testimonies were considered worth writing down. So that's really where a lot of the evidence that we have for philosophies of this period comes from. Is it's indirect kind of testimonial evidence of their beliefs. This imposes a really difficult burden on us. You know, if you've read a little bit of the material for this week, or if you're just about to do so, then one of the challenges of reading the philosophy that we're starting with is that it's so fragmentary, right? We're used to philosophy in the 21st century, it's an article or it's a book, right? It's a finished product of some sort. It's intended to be, sort of passed back and forth, and it's intended to be used in this academic environment and so on, right? The ancient Greeks had none of that. There's none of those intentions. It's not often a completed work, at least in the way that we would ordinarily think about that, right? And so we, as the readers of this material, have to do a lot of sympathetic reconstruction, right? And we're going to talk more about how to do that in particular as we get into the content a little bit later. But this is just to emphasize, like, this is a really long time ago in a very distinct cultural context from our own. And so part of understanding this philosophy has to involve our own suspension of these beliefs, these ideas, right? The whole scientific worldview that we have to think about the world, right? And try to approach the world as an ancient Greek had to do, right? So I have here the Archaic Age. Our timeline starts at around 700 BC because we think that everything like Thales is some of the earliest philosophical material. It's believed that the earliest date for that is about 625. The Archaic Age actually extends further into the past, right? But what causes this sort of break in the Archaic Age of Greek history is you get Pericles, who was an important politician, and the rise of Athens, and in particular, the rise of what are called city-states or polises, right? I have written down here in the terminology section here, polis, which means roughly city-state. It can be a little bit difficult to explain what the Greeks meant by a city-state, because it's quite different from the ways that we would ordinarily think about a kind of political organization, right? So like we all live, or probably many of us live, take classes in Albuquerque, right? And Albuquerque is a kind of political body, and it has jurisdiction over a certain piece of land, right? And you get charged for the crime, there's a judge, right? All this kind of stuff. That's what makes it a sort of political body that we are supposedly obligated to, right, in various ways. Now, what's distinctive about the polis, right, is that it's a kind of political formation which takes place in ancient Greek history because of the conditions of the terrain of Greece during this period. And keep in mind, when we say Greek philosophy, there's not a Greek nation, right? There's not like a Greek state or something like that, right? In the same way that we think about the United States as a government that controls the entire body of its territory, right? There is nothing like that. Humanity is not so far along such that we can control large swaths of territory in that way, although we are beginning to get there, right? What makes the polis sort of unique as a kind of political organization is that the terrain of ancient Greece, which is spread out all over, right? It includes parts of what we would now consider Turkey, it includes part of what we would consider Italy, right? And so on. They were just united by the fact that they spoke a similar language, right? And in virtue of speaking a similar language, these small, like little colonies of human civilization could communicate with one another and have, some degree of cultural intelligibility and unity with one another, right? And one thing, if you know about this region, is that it's like a highly mountainous region, right? You're by the Aegean Sea, right? There's a lot of terrain that is incredibly difficult to navigate, right? It's hard to invade ancient Greek city-states, right? On the one hand, you might have to come in through the ocean, which could be quite perilous in many circumstances, right? Or perhaps you might have to cross over the mountains or cross through mountains, and in that case, you're an invading army and you're approaching a group of people that know the terrain much better than you do, right? And so what this meant is that around, this period in the Archaic Age as well, right, you have the formation of these political communities that are able to kind of set up shop, in various locations all across what we would, in that period call Greece, right? And these little political city-states, these polises, they're able to have a relative kind of independence, right? Like, there's nobody telling them what to do. There's no, like, kind of big boss in town at this time, right? What makes them sort of unique and what makes them individual is precisely that their terrain sort of locks them in a certain way to a certain kind of way of organizing politically. And one thing that's unique about polises as well is that the polis includes not only like the city, but the surrounding agricultural area, right? And so that's quite unique because they were cities before this in the past. We have some degree of archaeological evidence to say that some of the ancestors of the ancient Greeks, the Mycenaeans, had cities, for example, or at least a city. But what's unique about polises is that they are, a sort of city, so you'd have some place like Athens or Sparta, but they would also control the surrounding agricultural area. They would kind of defend, whatever sort of small plot of territory that they had available to them and was defensible, because of the natural circumstances that are given to them, right? And so what happens is over time, there's constantly bandits everywhere, right? Raiders who are essentially like destroying all these kind of small villages and so on. And the more concentrated polises are able to defend against them, right? And the ones that are not so concentrated are not able to do that, right? And so you get this gradual concentration of people into these political communities where they all sort of defend one another, right? One thing that's really notable about ancient Greek political organization is that while sometimes there was just like tyranny, right? There's just some person and they were in charge, that at least some city-states didn't organize themselves this way, that they were democracies, right? If you know anything about ancient Athens is often referred to as like one of the first democracies and one of the first sort of like real political institutions to think about what democracy and political organization entails. I've read a little bit about this, and historians are not exactly sure how it is that, democracy emerges in these particular cases. There's sort of the belief that, a lot of times when you think about ancient warfare, you think about something akin to like professional soldiers, right? Like there's like hoplites or something like that. That would be the ancient Greek equivalent of a soldier, and they are professional, killers, right? But that's not really sustainable at this period of time, right? For every, hoplite that you have, for every person that you have where you can suit them up in armor and you can pay them full time in order to just be, causing ruckus, right? War and so on, that there are a whole bunch of agricultural farmers and so on that have to work in order to sustain the amount of wealth where you can even have a small army like that, right? And so some people believe that sometime in the Archaic Age that we don't exactly have any, real record of, that there was some sort of revolt of the people who constituted the vast bulk of sort of the defense, right, against some sort of tyrant, and that is sort of the emergence of the Athenian city-state and our earliest model for democracy. Down here I have demos, which means the people, right? So democracy is a form of political organization where the laws are decided by the people, right? Importantly, we should kind of criticize this and think about it a little bit deeper, right? Because for the ancient Greeks, it wasn't everybody, right? It wasn't all people. The ancient Greek society was a slave owning society, right? So oftentimes, what would happen is Greeks would, especially in what we call the classical period, they would have slaves, which were often people like spared in warfare and conflict and so on. And those people did not have, of course, the ability to participate in politics, right? Women did not have the ability to participate in politics in the same way that men do, right? So, of course, it is earliest form of democracy, but we shouldn't allow that word to make us think, oh, everyone decides on things, right? To the contrary, we're going to see that there are all sorts of problems related to governance in the Greek period. One thing that's worth saying too, just while we're talking about this, is that much of the evidence that we have for ancient Greek history, especially during this period that we call the classical period, centers around Athens, right? Athens is sort of the location where the most philosophy happens, right? It's a real military powerhouse, right? Basically, during the classical and the Hellenistic period, taking over large areas of the world in sort of imperial, imperial projects. And so, really, Athens is going to be our center of reference for quite a lot of what we discuss. And of course, like, we can't just say, oh, the ancient Greeks were democratic or something like that, right? No, only Athens was democratic. If you look at, other ancient Greek city-states that we have evidence concerning, right? For example, Sparta is in no way at all, right, a democracy. It is much closer to an oligarchy, right, which is sort of thought of as like rule by the best, right? The most manly men get to be in charge. So really what initiates the classical period is that Athens in particular and Greeks altogether begin start banding together and gaining more power, resisting the influence of Persia, for example, right? And they really enter into their own in terms of producing great works of literature, art, and so on, right? You had like epic poems like Homer and Hesiod and so on well into the Archaic Age, we believe. But around this time, you start getting like ancient Greek tragedy, right? If you're really interested in this stuff, I highly recommend that you take the Ancient Greek Thought class, which would deal a lot more with these sort of broader cultural considerations, right? We're mostly just going to talk about them today. And what the name, the Archaic Age, actually comes from art history. That the evidence that we have as far as ancient Greek sculptures and so on during this period is that they're largely imitations of Egyptian pieces, right? And so there's like a very certain style, right? Everyone is symmetrical, everyone is very like stiff, right? There's not a lot of movement, action, so on, right? In the pieces, the artistic pieces that are produced, right? But in contrast with the sort of concentration of Athenians together and the expanding power of Athens, right? You get more and more distinctive cultural productions, right? And this is why we think of this as the transition into the classical period, right? And we're going to see that there's also a transformation that occurs here in philosophy as well. Now, to kind of speed things along, what marks the end of the classical period is the death of Alexander the Great, who we're going to talk more about, is a very important historical figure, right? And it goes until about 31 BC, which is the rise of Augustus, who is a very important Roman emperor, right? And so if you have these sort of like traditional narratives of Western history, then they will often start with the ancient Greeks, right? And then move chronologically on to the Romans, right? And so corresponding to these three periods of ancient Greek history, we can say that there are roughly three periods of philosophy produced in ancient Greek philosophy, and these are going to be what we focus on. There's pre-Socratic philosophy, so this is philosophy that comes before Socrates, right? This is going to be characteristic largely of the Archaic Age, so this is going to be the oldest material, really, that we have. And this is what we're studying really for this week and next week. Then, corresponding to the classical period in ancient Greek history, we have Socratic philosophy, which is really going to center around three figures, namely Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates is actually quite like the pre-Socratics in a lot of ways. He didn't write anything down. And so everything that we know about Socrates, we largely get from Plato, although there are a couple of other important sources. So we know that Socrates is not an invention of Plato's, for example. And, you know, importantly, there's sort of this lineage where Socrates is the teacher of Plato, Plato is the teacher of Aristotle, and Aristotle was the tutor of Alexander the Great, right? So it's really the downfall of Alexander the Great that sort of marks this Hellenistic period, which is thought of as sort of the end of ancient Greek supremacy. Importantly, it's worth mentioning that like a lot of philosophy classes just cut this out, right? They don't think it's very relevant or interesting or something like that. They would rather spend more time in the classical period. But we in this class are going to spend at least a few weeks at the end of the course discussing Hellenistic philosophy. So one thing that you might wonder, right? You might wonder like, well, isn't there philosophy before, you know, this timeline? Namely, like Homer and Hesiod, right? We described Homer and Hesiod as epic poets, and they actually go far before Thales and many of the other figures that we're going to discuss. So, like, why does this history begin here? An important moment in ancient Greek philosophy, the reason why we say that ancient Greek philosophy starts here, starts with Thales, for example, and not with Homer, is that Homer and Hesiod provide something like an account of the world, right? They're like, hey, this is what the world is like. The world is ruled by these gods. The gods enjoy when you make certain sacrifices, etc., to them. And so otherwise the world is chaos, and that's sort of like maybe the thesis of the world that is implied by Homer and Hesiod, right? But importantly, Homer and Hesiod still have the form of mythos, right? It's a mythology, right? And a mythos is a story, right? And again, think about the oral tradition, right? This was primarily an oral tradition, especially near its origin, right? And so it wasn't attempting to give something like um, a theoretically sophisticated account or something like that. It's meant to be a story where you pass down your common heritage with other people, and it has to be memorable, right? You have to be able to recount it and say it to other people and not have it written down for you, right? And so these myths are a way of reproducing a kind of cultural identity, and that cultural identity is very much expressed in philosophy and in mythology. But what makes philosophy different from this is that you start to give something like an account, right? A logos, right? I have logos written here. This is a very dense ancient Greek word. It can mean like logic or word or account, right? It's the way things are, right? And so, what makes philosophers different, the reason why Homer and Hesiod are not philosophers, and we say that philosophy starts with this guy, Thales, is that they move beyond merely giving a story, a mythos of the logos, right? They're not just giving a story that's intended to be an account, but they're giving something like an arche, a foundation, right? They're attempting not just to think about the world in a sort of imagistic way, but to like really characterize it the way that it is, right? To know the truth about fundamental reality and not just like be entertained by it, right? One thing that I think of all the time, right, is that if you're Homer or Hesiod or someone, and someone says, "Oh, you know, your piece was really beautiful," right? Then that's satisfying insofar as you're producing a work of art, right? But if you're approaching something philosophically and you say it's beautiful, right? It's like, okay, but is it true, right? Perhaps in the case of mythology, of mythos, of story, the criteria of adequacy, what makes something good or not, right, is something. Ooh, sorry. I lost my train of thought. What makes something adequate is not being able to give a beautiful story about it, right? But instead, what makes an account, a logos, adequate is that it's rational, right? You start to give rational explanations of the world around you, where what you're centrally concerned with is the truth of what you're saying, right? And so obviously there's going to be some kind of blending, right, that happens between mythology, right, this sort of imagistic way of thinking about the world, perceiving the world, right, and philosophical knowledge, right. And so philosophy, especially in its origin, looks a lot like poetry, right? It looks a lot like how people might express what's like the most important to them, right? And we can imagine that because poetry, right, the epic poems and so on, these are an expression of what people consider to be of foundational, fundamental importance and like an expression of what the world's really like, right? So obviously it has that in common with philosophy. But what's important for philosophy is that we move beyond a story to an explanation, right? There's more terminology here. Arche, as I mentioned, is like foundation. You might think of like archaeology, for example. Mythos, story. Nous means like thinking, right? Phusis means nature, right? The nature of something. We talked about a polis. Arete is a word that we're going to come across a lot this semester that sort of means virtue or excellence, right? Demos we talked about, logos we talked about, Epirion we're about to talk about in a bit, and oikos means family or economy, right? That might sound like a weird association to us now, right? But really, if you think about it from an ancient Greek perspective, managing your economy just is managing your household, right? And so oikos, econ, right? Oikonomia, right? This is the ancient Greek word for that, right? Okay, and so three of the philosophical traditions that I had you look at for this first week that are our first real opportunities to start to think about ancient Greek philosophy are the Milesian philosophers, Pythagoras, the Pythagoreans, and Xenophanes. And we will discuss Heraclitus in a video um, forthcoming. Thales famously said that the arche, the foundation of the world, was water, right? That might not strike you as very impressive, right? You think of the whole world as water or something like that, right? Why would you think that? Well, one explanation that we get from Aristotle, right? It's already like you can already see that the distance between like 625 and 300 is that Aristotle, who lived during this period, basically has to guess at what Thales' motivations for what he says really are. And you'll see this in your reading term. We don't have very much, right? Aristotle is really the first person, to my knowledge, to say Thales is the first philosopher, right? And with Thales, you get a lot of, classical stories about philosophers, right? One of them is that Thales was so concerned with the stars and so on, right? Heavenly objects, that he tripped and all of these people laughed at him, said it was all classic philosopher stuff, right? Then he predicted an eclipse and made a bunch of money as a result of that, and so they were kind of forced to accept that he had some kind of esoteric knowledge and so on, right? And Aristotle tries to explain the fact that Thales thought everything was water through the insight that all forms of life, right, that we know of are water-based forms of life, right? They all need water, right? And so what strikes us as maybe a little strange, right? Why would you think everything is water? We can see that it had some sort of rational foundation. Thales thought, okay, well, living beings come from water, right? Living beings seem really different from water, so maybe all this other stuff that we think of as really different, rocks and trees and chairs and so on, right, are also kind of configurations of water or stem from water, ultimately, right? And what is important about Thales is not so much the specifics of his account, right? It's not that we're supposed to be really impressed that he thinks everything is water or something like that, right? But instead, we're supposed to be impressed because, thousands of years ago, we see the origin of a sort of intellectual inquiry where you try to figure out what the arche, the foundation of everything really is. And Thales is one of the first, at least in the ancient Greek tradition, where he gives a substantive answer to that question, right, and argues on its behalf, right? And so similarly, Thales' student, Anaximander, he thought that the fundamental nature of the universe was apeiron, right? And this is an alpha primitive, right? That's amoral, right? It means so not, and then perion is bounded, right? So Anaximander thought that the fundamental nature of the universe was to be unbounded, right? To be ever flowing, more and more stuff, right? And then his student, Anaximenes, thought this was a little bit too vague, right? And he postulated instead that the arche was air, right? So you can see, right, what is the earliest ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers? Well, they're all attempting to give an account, right, a logos of the arche, right? They're attempting to give a logic or an account or something like that of the foundation of the world, right? What is the stuff, the world, that nature is all made of, right? And in Thales, you start with an account that says water, right? In Anaximander, you kind of move to this more theoretical account where he says it's boundless, right? And then Anaximenes is an attempt to sort of bring it back to earth in various ways, right? Similarly, right, in this attempt at giving accounts of things, right, one of the ways that you give an account of something is through mathematics, right? And the Pythagoreans are a really interesting sect of philosophers centering around Pythagoras. They basically lived in a cult, and they had lots of very strange, interesting beliefs, right? But they are all sort of centered on the idea that the universe is mathematically structured, right? You might recall from high school or something like that, right? The Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? And you can see how this mathematical count is closely tied to this new emphasis on logic, on logos, right? Because in mathematical accounts, you're giving sort of a general account, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared isn't about a particular triangle. It's not about that triangle, right? It's not about some other triangle. It's about the essence of triangles, right? It's about all triangles. It's about the nature of triangles in general, right? And so, the Pythagoreans thought that the universe was mathematically structured. And so, you might think that there are various reasons for why you would think this, right? If you build a building and you use right angles on your walls, they will be a lot more stable, right, than they would be otherwise. You have, really complex artistic works and metallurgy and so on going on in this period, right? Those all seem to also have a mathematical structure, right? Poems, similarly, mathematical structure. And so the Pythagoreans really latched onto this, right? And they also sort of latched onto like a lot of mysticism stuff too, right? Because if you start seeing all these mathematical relationships between everything, then one, next step that you might take is to, kind of mythologize it in some way, right? So, like, the Pythagoreans thought that one was sort of like the essence of goodness, right? And two is evil, and so on, right? And so you get all of these associations between, these different mathematical relationships, right? And so some of it is nonsense, of course, right? But the deeper insight, right, that the universe is itself mathematically structured is quite astounding, right? And that's a different kind of account than saying that the world is water or something like that, right? And then finally, I apologize for this video going on a little long. I didn't intend to, but it's important to try to give as much background as possible. Third, here we have Xenophanes, who I think is really interesting as one of the first recorded instances of what we might call an epistemological critique, right? So epistemology, episteme, right? That's a Greek word that just means knowledge, right? So epistemology is just the study of knowledge, right? And let's maybe write this one down. Episteme. Knowledge. And so Xenophanes is interesting because he's like maybe one of the first people to say something like, well, how do you know that? Right? You say that the whole world is water, or you say that the whole world is unbounded, or you say that the whole world is air, or maybe you're like Homer or Hesiod and you say the whole world is chaos, right? How do you know that, right? How do you give an account of that, right? And Xenophanes, is in many ways a relativist, right? Xenophanes will say things like, okay, well, what tastes bitter to me might taste sweet to you, and so on, right? And so, what's the truth? Is it bitter or is it sweet, right? And part of the thrust of what Xenophanes is saying is that, well, there is no truth about that, right? That it's not like it's really ultimately bitter or ultimately sweet. It's instead something relative, right? And then that relativism is importantly connected with, let me move out of the way here, a critique of anthropomorphism, right? So Xenophanes says, okay, well, certain things are sweet to you, but they are, bitter to me, better and perhaps sweet to me and better to you, and so on, right? Then couldn't we also say this for our conception of the gods, right? Or, you might say the divine or fundamental reality, right? We think reality is set up to be for us, right? So, like, when we taste something sweet, we just think, oh, that's sweet, right? We don't recognize that it's relative, right? And so, similarly, we imagine that our gods are people that look just like us, right? And that's confirmed if you consult like the Homer and the Hesiod and how they depict the gods, right? The gods get pissed, they're angry, they are short-tempered, and so on, right? And so they are a reflection of what the Greeks took to be um, a model of excellence for human beings, right? But in so doing, they also attribute to those gods human faults, right? And Xenophanes tries to suggest, like, well, if you could ask a horse would have horse gods. If you could ask a chicken would have chicken gods, and so on, right? And the implication is that our own belief that fundamental reality is like relative to us, that it's similar to us, that it conforms with us, with our expectations, that it's set up for our well-being, right? Xenophanes says we have no justification for that, right? The relative nature of our phrase should give us reason to be suspicious, right? Okay, that is just a really brief introduction to the first few philosophers that we are discussing, as well as the period as a whole. I apologize for the length of this video. I'll try to keep these videos shorter in general. Please also, for this first week, check out the next video, which will be a deep dive for the first time into a pre-Socratic philosopher that we're going to be discussing together, namely Heraclitus. It'll be really great. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you're having a great week. Bye.